Hi. So you want to write an econometric research paper. Where do you start? You got to start with a research question, the thing that your paper is about, this topic that you're going to investigate, hopefully test some kind of hypothesis, using these new tools that you're going to pick up. So it has to start with a research question. Now, this should be an interesting research question. I can't tell you exactly what interesting means. It depends on the field. Some fields find some particular questions particularly interesting and others not so much. Some fields have glaring, gaping holes in their research body and everyone's trying to fill those holes. Some are like completely paved over and there's really not much new, and then there's nothing interesting. So you have to kind of know like context, and I can't give that for you. Now, for the purposes of a research paper for a class, I'd start with what interests you. And I can't answer that for you either, but here's a way to think about it. When you get drunk with your smart friends, what do you guys argue about? Like when you have those rare, awesome conversations with your smart friends and you're pulling stuff from all kinds of different classes that you've been in and you're arguing back and forth, getting all riled up, geeking out. What was that about? What was that topic? Because that's the thing that you're really interested in. And that'll kind of give you some juice to get through the whole research process, is thinking, I'm going to learn something new about this field that I'm passionate about. So ask yourself, what do you argue with when you argue with your smart friends? Like, not the dumb ones that you like to go to parties with. I'm talking about the smart ones that you got to drag out of the house. Those are the ones. Now, for an econometrics paper, here's some guidelines. Your research question really can't be an ethical one. It can't be a normative question. It has to be a positive one, something that really boils down to, what is the correlation between X and Y? Econometrics ultimately is just correlations between different variables. So can you boil down or distill what you're interested in into a X and Y kind of statement? Like, you might be passionate about gender equality, but can you rephrase that in terms of something like, what is the relationship between gender and income, or gender and unemployment, or something like that? If you can phrase it in terms of a correlation between X and Y kind of statement, you're on, the right track. Now, your research paper also has to be feasible. And I know this probably sounds obvious, but it's not always obvious what is and isn't feasible. So you should probably bounce ideas off of your professor. The thing is, you should be able to state your hypothesis in some kind of precise, objective way, and at least in theory be able to disprove it. Right? It should be possible at least in theory. Now, it also has to be possible in practice too, which means you need to be able to find the data. There's all kinds of really interesting questions, and you might not have access to that kind of data. If your questions involve illegal drug use, they're really interesting questions. Where are you going to find the data? Who's going to tell you how much illegal drugs they took? You might want to know what the relationship is between drug use and income, but that data is hard to find. Or you might be curious about drug use and medical outcomes. In fact, anything having to do with medical outcomes, it's really hard to get. You're not a hospital. You don't have access to those kinds of data, and they're not allowed to share it with you. It's a law. They can't. Likewise, if you're interested in educational outcomes, a lot of that data is also protected by law. A teacher cannot share it with you. So I'd look elsewhere for some data. Your research question should have some kind of solid justification. Right? It shouldn't just be, what's the correlation between random X and random Y? No one will find that interesting. It's got to have some really solid reason why those two should be correlated in the first place. And then you can test whether they are or aren't correlated. All right? And then again, try to pick something that, other people might find interesting and might want to read. There's really no point in writing a research paper that no one ends up reading. Okay, so how do you start off the research project? you need a research question. Correlation between X and Y. So your research question is about the correlation between some X variable and some Y variable. I think it's best to think of it just from the get-go as you've got a scatter plot. You've got observations on X and observations on Y. Those make an XY pair, and then you plot the scatter plot. At least in your mind, be able to draw what you think that relationship should look like. Again, it should only involve two variables, X and Y. And you should, in your mind, at least be able to kind of draw the picture that best fits these things. So it should look something like, get my pen. So you should be able to draw this line. Okay, now ask yourself, what does each particular point represent? Because you're going to have to collect that data. So is this a particular country? You know, maybe this is the USA, and then you might have, you know, Greece, Spain, and the UK, or something like that. Are you doing, is your level of analysis at the country level, or is it an individual level? Like if we were doing income differences over, let's say, education. I think those are positively correlated. The more educated you are, the more money you'll make. And so what is each of these dots? Now it's no longer a country. This might be a hypothetical person, person 1, and this could be person 2. You won't know their names. Your data set will be anonymized, but you might conceive of having access to this database. Let's say the data set from the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the census collects this kind of information. So you should at least be able to answer the following question. At what level of analysis am I going to do my research? That's going to be determined by what data you have access to. This will force you to think about what kind of data you're going to have. And it's going to prevent you from just saying, well, you know, I've often wondered about X and Y, and then you run off into some tangent where you can't even get data. So it's best to think about data from the get-go by doing a scatter plot and then asking, what is each particular point, and can I get access to those particular points? Now the next step is to ask yourself what other variables are important. Let's go back to this idea of gender and income. Okay, so income will be your Y variable, and you want to know how differences in gender might affect income. Well, you need to ask yourself, what are all of the other variables that could affect income? So you do want to compare apples with apples, right? So it does you no good to just compare average income for men and average income for women. I mean, that's a starting place. That's where it all starts. But that can't be the ending point, because even if you find that women earn a lot less than men do, someone could just turn around and say, well, you're comparing apples with oranges. Maybe men are more educated. Actually, it turns out they're not. Men are less educated. But someone could say, you know, you didn't take into account all these other factors that could explain the correlation between X and Y. So it's up to you as a researcher to accommodate all of those other variables and say, I've already accounted for the effects of all these other things that might lead to a wage difference between genders, and I've corrected for them, and I still find income inequality. Now that becomes compelling research. See, the thing is, whenever you're doing a controlled experiment in science, like think back to high school physics class, when they were explaining to you what the scientific process is. They said, all right, you got to have everything under controlled environments. And so if you want to know what the relationship is between pressure and temperature, you got to keep volume the same and keep everything else the same, and just vary the one variable and see how it affects the other one. The critical part of this is that you had to keep everything else the same and only vary that one variable to see what its effect is on Y. Well, as a social scientist, you have to do the same thing. You can't do a controlled experiment. It turns out that there are statistical ways to keep the effects of other variables constant. This idea of keeping everything else constant, ceteris paribus, if you're, into the old Latin. Ceteris paribus just means keeping everything else constant. And the only way that you're going to convince someone that gender affects income differences is if you've also controlled for all of the other ways that people's incomes can vary. And then, well, you've got your controlled experiment, and now you can say, listen, I think I've got something here. There's a difference in incomes. So, just to recap, phrase your research question as, what's the correlation between X and Y? And the next step is, give me a whole bunch of other X variables that could also affect Y. That tells you all the data that you need to collect. Now, it should go without saying, but I'm going to say it right now, that you need to review the literature. In the paper writing process, like when you're typing your paper, you start out with the research question, you explain why it's interesting to you, then you need to review the literature. And this is your way of telling the reader a couple of things. First of all, it establishes your credentials. You know the field. You also know what's interesting, and you know where the holes in the research are. And those are the ones that you're trying to fill with your paper. You should always be reading the relevant scientific literature to know what's interesting and to stay up on things. It also helps you, though, in figuring out not just what the interesting research questions are, it also helps you to find data. So all those X's that you said were relevant, you got to find data for that. Right? So here's that last bullet point where I say other published articles. Whenever you're reading a research paper, they'll tell you where they got their data. You could maybe re-examine that same data set, examine it from a different angle using a different technique or something like that. There's always tons of data that's publicly available from government agencies, Census Bureau, Bureau of Labor Statistics, etc. Don't overlook those. Yes, they've been mined 1 million times over, but they're solid data sets. If you can get your hand on business data, you're golden. Because usually that kind of data is proprietary and it's closely held, and they don't want their competitors having access to their data. So they usually don't share it very widely. But if you can get your hand on that, you've got an unmapped, untapped data set, you're off and running. You're in good shape. If you need to, there's all kinds of public information out there, but it's in a disaggregated form. You might need to write your own web scraper to put structure on unstructured data and gather it up and put it into a tabular format so that you can do some nice statistics on it. Gathering the data takes so much time. The joke among statisticians is that data gathering and data cleaning and all that is what you do as a data scientist from Monday through Thursday. The data science part is what you do on Friday. So 80% of your time is just spent trying to find the data. Don't get discouraged. This is an essential part of the whole process. It's not the sexiest, most exciting part of the research process. It turns out it's probably the most important. So don't give up hope. Just keep digging. You'll find something. So once you have the data, then what? Start simple. Just summarize your data. The best way to summarize data is with a graph. Just graph your data. That X variable and that Y variable that you said were so important and that was the central piece of your research topic, how about you graph that? Give me a scatter plot between X and Y. Or if it's about gender and income inequality, give me a bar chart, one for men, one for women, that shows the relevant incomes. Then your paper can explore why those two bar charts differ. So just summarize your data. A nice little summary table also goes a long way. Maybe 2 little tables, one for income and education levels for men, and another one income and education levels for women. And this lets people just do some simple side-to-side comparisons. You're still not actively holding all else constant, but a lot of times that graph and those summary tables actually have more of an emotional impact on your readers. It's not fancy statistics, but it actually goes a long way because everyone can wrap their brain around a scatter plot or a table. Now, once you've done that, now it's time for some serious statistical work. Now you've got to analyze the data. That involves a whole bunch of stuff from selecting which variables are statistically significant, if you need to transform your variables in different ways, logarithms or not, squared terms and not. That's its own thing. That you'll study in class. You'll spend a whole lot of time with those details. Finally, let's say that you finally have your regression. Well, then what? You need to translate that back into English. You need to answer your research question. You need to discuss what you found. You can't just end with the table. You have to say, well, my table shows this. Therefore, income inequality, that. This particular number that I calculated shows X. And it's up to you to explain to your reader what those results mean in the context of your research question. It also means that you need to loop in the research that you surveyed in your literature review. So if, for example, someone was saying there's no such thing as income inequality among genders, once you control for education, you can turn around and say, no, I did control for education and there's still a big gap. Authors A and B and C, they're wrong. And this research paper that I just wrote proves you that A, B, and C are wrong. Your reader won't know the literature well enough to do that. Your readers only have limited attention spans. You need to hit them over the head with, they said this, they are wrong, I am right, here's why I'm right, here was the evidence that I just showed you that the other ones were wrong. Or maybe you want to say, I thought these guys were right, I ran this other test, and they are right, and this is further support for my thesis. Whatever it is, though, you have to say that kind of thing. You need to wrap it all up in a bow for your reader and explain its relevance to all of the researchers who are interested in that field. And finally, conclude. That usually involves just summarizing what you set out to do, what made your approach novel, what your results were, and why they're important. After that, you just have to send it to a journal for them to tell you that you did it wrong. I'm joking, but only a little bit. They usually tell you did it wrong and you've got to revise. Just make peace with that. Thanks for listening.